very pleased and honored to be here at the IAA Cabana with two experts, Emmanuelle from PwC and Doug from Reed Smith. And Doug is the general counsel, as Michael said, of Reed Smith, and Emmanuelle Rivet is PwC's expert in this arena, and they've been doing a lot of work in the arena of advertising and accountability and transparency. We're not going to go into detail about what the ANA report said last year, but in shorthand, the ANA commissioned a report with K2 to analyze the flow of money in the industry and whether there were issues regarding transparency. And the findings of that report were very troubling and somewhat headline gathering, that there were significant issues in the industry and there were significant gaps in the knowledge arena between agencies and advertising in being transparent on the flow of the money and the ability to follow the money. Doug, is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think the conclusion that is most telling in what you said is the lack of knowledge, as opposed to any specific intent or any schemes or conspiracies that some of the headlines wanted to imply. I think it was just a disconnect that happened over many years as the agency business transpired from a pure commission-based system to a much more complicated system where agencies needed to have revenue flows and profits, and they found ways to do that the advertisers may not have been fully aware of. And the K2 report sort of lifted that curtain and startled some people in the industry to sort of wake up and be aware of what's going on.
And the word of the year has been transparency, and it was the word of the year in 2016. And when we talk about transparency, it's transparency of incentives and rebates and the issue of follow money. Emmanuelle, you come from PwC, which is a consulting firm. All agencies now know that consulting business is now in the agency business too. But at the beginning, PwC is an accounting firm. So tell us about transparency and what's your reaction to the report, what PwC's reaction and the agency reaction last year.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carla. Obviously, the agency reactions, we all read the public statements that they made last year when the report was issued, and there were a lot of questions, right? They raised questions around the scope, the methodology, as well as the findings of the report. Now, I think, though, they've not ignored the report. Indeed, there's been quite a bit of dialogue in the industry, which I think is probably a good thing, because it feels like, as Doug said, there was a lot of misunderstanding of what the different players were doing, particularly with the entrance of internet and social media company, ad platform, ad tech companies more broadly. And there was quite a bit of misunderstanding of what the different parties were doing, what the limitations were, what the capabilities were, et cetera. So we've seen a lot of dialogue. We are supportive of that dialogue, obviously. And I think you asked, Carla, what we're doing. So we are trying to help bring trust back into the ecosystem by providing assessments or audits or analyses of those processes and systems, as well as making recommendations.
Doug, you work with a lot of advertisers. Two questions. What was the advertiser immediate reaction, and do you think anything has changed from last year to this year?
Yeah, the first reaction was disbelief. Because they were basically caught, if you will, being unaware of things that one could argue under various legal and business theories they should have been aware of, and they were not. So they were caught, unaware of what was going on. The reaction over this past year has been a slow evolution that did a lot of introspective thinking on the advertiser level about how I can address these kinds of things. And then secondly, I think another sort of tipping point was when Mark Pritchard, and you'll have again here tomorrow, announced a couple of months ago that the theory was this couldn't be happening at Procter. Procter must have everything buttoned up because Procter always has everything buttoned up. And then when he took an introspective look, he realized and he found and he publicly stated that Procter didn't have it buttoned up. Now, if Procter doesn't have it buttoned up, I think the revelation to the rest of the industry is all of the rest of you don't either. And therefore, you really need to take a big, hard look at this. And that's really sort of ratcheted up the examination over the last 2 or 3 months since those revelations, if you will, hit the marketplace. So the reaction was shock, and now it's into fixing the problem and addressing the problem more aggressively.
And like many things, the whole story is sometimes underneath the table. Sometimes it's behind the curtain. Sometimes it's things we don't see. Is there anything that you can talk about that has happened over the past year?
Oh, but there's been some press reports about settlements for past practices, and I'm not going to either admit or deny whether they exist or not. But the press is pretty careful in what they report. What I can say is that there's a lot of renegotiation of existing contracts, which is in and of itself a really interesting exercise because many of them don't even know where their contract is. They're searching in drawers all over their offices to find it, and then when they find it, it's 10 years old. So the renegotiation is really kind of almost a comical affair in terms of what's this in it? There's no internet in here. There's no digital in this contract, and yet they're spending millions of dollars in digital. So there's a lot of that is going on. I think what we're seeing a lot of now is in new RFPs, that there's a much bigger concentration and focus on transparency in the RFPs, which sort of puts some of those who don't want to be transparent in the marketplace in a tougher situation. You know, the reality is that according to press reports, 80% of the $500 billion is handled by 6 or so companies. What we're finding is that a lot of the companies outside that school of 6, the oligopoly that controls most of this business, are beginning to rise and becoming apparent that they are willing to take an operating approach that is far more transparent. Now, are they big enough to handle huge accounts? Perhaps not. But there is a slow but steady change happening in the marketplace that's taken a year to ferment, but I think it's really getting to get some momentum now.
As many people know, I spent almost 4 decades within the agency, working at a wonderful company, Leo Burnett Worldwide, within the legal, corporate affairs, government affairs arena, working on dozens and dozens of client agency contracts. If one of the issues, if not the issue, is the understanding of the client agency contract, when we're talking about transparency, what should an agency do? What should a client do within their focus on the client agency contract? What should they be looking at?
I will defer to Emmanuelle on this because it's one word: audit. Yeah. I mean, and defining what an audit is and the scope of that audit and how, to what degree you are either able to or prevented from following the money. Because it's not a simple thing as me giving you a buck and saying, where did the buck go? And Emmanuelle can elucidate that.
What you're talking about then, Doug, is looking at your audit clause and renegotiating the audit clause, allowing the audit to take place.
Yeah, I think it's that, the audit clause. It's also the terms of the contract, what you're allowed to have access, what you're allowed to see, what you're not allowed to see. And then really making the terms simple and understandable. I think there's been a lot of, as Doug mentioned, a lot of reopening of contracts, understanding of contracts that have taken place. We've seen an uptick on requests for auditing processes, systems, as well as auditing some of the transactions, really. We've actually partnered with White Ops to do some of those analyses because this is also a very complex environment. And because a lot of advertising is now online and automated, it's not that simple to be able to trace a transaction through, but there are techniques that are being in place and used.
Let's talk about the complexity within the marketplace. As you walk around up and down here in Cannes, there's a lot of digital suppliers. We're talking about programmatic buying. We're talking about complex media system. We have a business that grew up in a different age. Can we just talk about how maybe is that a potential issue?
Well, one of the observations that's been made that I think is very telling is that the digital system as we know it was not built for advertising. That wasn't the design basis when they first started out. So advertising is layered on top of this mess that we have. And programmatic has become the buzzword of being able to go out there and get real-time bidding and immediate responses or whatever it is. And they're talking about how programmatic will expand into all the other silos as well, that someday network television will be programmatic and everything's going to be programmatic. Well, I think what we're facing, and I think that you've seen, Emmanuelle, in your work, is that before we jump into this mess any deeper, they better fix the mess. And they better fix the accountability of the mess, the trackability of the mess, the viewability. All these issues that are going on are making this incredibly complex. And there are so many levers and so many players in the business that it's not simple. It was simple when I bought network television. I could, figure it out. When I bought a magazine, I could figure it out. You try to figure out the digital space, and then you've got the ultimate consulting deal that you'll ever get.
I think we started out saying what's changed from the issuance of the report to today. And what I hear, and what I do agree, that the report is the report. It identified a lot of issues, a lot of problems. I think some of the hostility has been taken out of the room, but much of the confusion is still there, and much of the need for dialogue and discussion. But the honesty's been broken. The trust has been broken. Is that fair?
That's probably fair. I think there is trust only exists if people are communicating and expectations are clear. And I think a lot of what had happened is not necessarily bad intent or doing wrong. It's just a lack of understanding of the party's expectations. It goes from the CMO who has certain expectation on returns, and different CMOs and companies have different way of measuring ROI, which makes it complicated. And then you have ad platforms that are highly technology driven that do a lot of great things and have done immense amount of progress over time. They also feel their world is not understood. You move from an upfront contract, as you said, Doug, right, where you negotiate for the next year your ads on TV at a fixed price, and you move to an ad world where the advertising, an ad placement price is changing by the second, determined by complex algorithm and bidding and auction systems. And so you also create a lot of data that needs to be analyzed, and there is probably also in the supply chain a need for more ad analytics or data analytics capabilities. So I think all of that is coming together, and it has been the challenge of this world kind of being created, and suddenly billions of people online and having to reach this audience online, but having to deal with more technology and contract terms that
Let
were not
me
maybe
add
adequate.
one thing to
Yeah.
that in terms of the trust fact that you
Yes.
talked about. And I was saying earlier when we were talking that, if you walk along the avenue here, you see the pictures of Muhammad Ali in various stages of his career. And I sometimes picture the agency side of this business as being the victim of Muhammad Ali, being knocked down every time they get up. So we had the media transparency problem. That was the knockdown number one. Then we just recently had the programmatic report out of the ANA that talked about the availability of transparency and trackability in the marketplace that big agencies did not participate in, but they proved that at least on the demand side, you could have complete transparency. That was sort of punch number two. And punch number three is going to come out in the next few weeks when the ANA releases its report on production transparency. So the transparency is definitely the buzzword, and the trust factor, every time it seems to improve a little bit, there's another punch that comes in. So it's a real challenge today. It may not be as public, but privately, I don't know that the trust is back yet at all.
I want to just quickly jump on your comment about production, because in the United States, there's been a very significant study or investigation, criminal investigation by the Department of Justice of the industry in the arena of production. And those findings haven't come forward, but is it something that you think that the people in this room, the people outside the room walking around, advertising agencies and advertisers, should we be concerned about the investigation of the production industry?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen so many times in media that just getting charged or suspected is enough to be convicted as far as the public is concerned. So Rebecca Mickeljohn, who's the U.S. attorney in New York, is investigating what she believes to be apparently bid rigging in the production business and commercial post-production and editing and other related areas. This is the same person, I would remind everybody, who sent people to prison in 2002 for bid rigging in the production business. So this is not something that she's not familiar with and is back, and back in a way that is pretty aggressive. And she spoke at a conference in April where she started off saying essentially, I'm not going to talk about an active investigation, which they all do. And then she proceeded to talk for quite a while about investigating the industry in production, but talk more about the industry in general. So anytime you get into the scope or the crosshairs of the Department of Justice, you need to be concerned, because that's serious stuff, and watch that in the marketplace, because it can spill over into other things. If she issues indictments, which could happen any time or maybe not at all, that'll be a sea change moment for this industry.
And should people in different countries outside the United States care about what the United States government is doing in the United States industry? Are there implications, are there ripple effects outside the United States if the United States government brings some advertising executives to jail?
I would think so, particularly in the global nature of this market, and production is not exclusively limited to the United States by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, how many companies have made the mistake of not thinking about European regulators when they just sort of nonchalantly only worry about U.S. regulations and vice versa? there's a legion of stories of where folks made that mistake, and that mistake could happen again.
And as far as, I know that's a big bell to ring when you talk about people going to jail, but as Doug said, this situation did happen within the last 20 years, and the same person who brought those executives to jail on the same issue is now reinvestigating the industry. So it's something to watch. When you think about what's coming next, wait for the outcome of that investigation in the United States, and perhaps audits in the production arena are as important as following the money in the media buying arena.
Well, yeah, I'd also remind everybody that the most celebrated is the imprisonment of the folks in the bid rigging case back in 2002. But in the years that have passed, there have been other criminal prosecutions for mishandling of government funds in media by various participants in the marketplace. So this is not unique just to production. It's this issue of fiduciary duties owed to whoever your advertisers, particularly if they're government agencies, is a very real thing, and it's an ongoing thing. So you can't ignore that. If there's an indictment in production, you got to worry about just who's looking at what in other areas as well.
Okay, let's go back to data and the potential for, we hear about bot fraud and ad fraud and source traffic issues. This is the complicated arena, Emmanuelle, that you were talking about. And so how does that envelope fit into how does that create the envelope that all of this other inquiry is moving into?
Yeah, that probably is one of the other factors that has created this lack of trust and concern in the industry. Now, if you take the different players, and large players have very sophisticated ways of dealing with ad fraud, and it starts with screening vendors or small online publishers, all the way to filtering out bad clicks or bad impressions. So a lot is being done. Obviously, always more can be done. And I think there was a recent report by White Ops that indicated that already click fraud, I think, is going down by 10% this year. So progress are being made. Programmatic was one of the areas where click fraud was considered to be really substantive and widespread. It's probably one of the areas where a lot of progress has been made. Part of it is also because when it comes to programmatic buying, it's a fragmented industry with smaller players that are not that sophisticated companies in the small emerging company space, and they're all learning and getting up to speed and getting better.
And source traffic, Doug, do you have anything to share about what your thoughts are?
I think that there may be a moratorium on source traffic around the corner. Essentially, while, as Emmanuelle said, there are a lot of improvements happening. They're getting better accountability and the like, but until that is fixed, for marketers to be using source traffic to fill in the pipeline of the long tail of publishers, when you look at the amount of bots that are in there, the amount of fraud that's in there, the risks and brand safety that exist in them, there's a school of thought that is beginning to come to fruition that advertisers ought to say no source traffic. That I'd rather pay more in a CPM for premium publishers and folks that I know have human beings and people who will respond than to get some artificial numbers down and get my CPM down to a ridiculously low level when in fact most of that are not even human. So I'm really not getting anything out of this. So I think that there's a potential change that is saying in the marketplace, fix it so that we can properly filter source traffic, but until it's fixed, we don't want it. Now, the negative side of that is a lot of small publishers are going to be hurt by that. Because they're going to sort of fall into that huge basket of source traffic. But that may be the unfortunate side effect of trying to fix this problem rather than be part of the problem.
We don't like to talk about specific laws because it gets complicated and time-consuming, but there is a new law in France that's worth mentioning in this exact area. Do you want to talk about it first, Emmanuelle, then Doug?
Yeah, probably I leave it to the lawyers to talk about it.
But you've got that great French
That's
accent
never
to talk
good.
about
Leave it
it.
to the lawyers. That's the way lawyers and accountants work together. We blame the accountants blame us. It works out just perfectly.
Yeah. Well, I think just for everyone, it's just a law that initially in France applied to the advertising world, but not the online advertising, right? And now it requires transparency. It requires media and publishers to provide information directly to marketers about what has been served and the price. So there is a little bit more forced transparency in the space, and that's effective January 1st. Right?
January 1st, this new law in France goes into effect. The idea that it's taking transparency from the traditional media to the digital media is a story in of itself. But the really interesting thing that is we're going to have to wait and see what happens, is that this new legislation has extraterritorial effect. So arguably it is saying that for me to be able to know between me and if I'm the brand and the other person is the agency, the buyer, for me to understand the true transparency and the legitimacy of your buys in France, I have to know whether that any media was, giving you dollars back outside of France. Otherwise, I don't have the full picture. And we're gonna wait and see how that gets resolved with this this new French legislation. Because if you carve out these contracts, you'll often see that principal transactions are allowed everywhere in Europe except France.
So what's
so
coming
that's gonna be
next
the
then?
exception.
Could I say another thing that's coming next is there's more law, there's more regulatory oversight potential, there's more government interest in this area of transparency and honesty, and between the DOJ investigation in the production arena and the French law, we're dealing in a complicated business that has become increasingly complicated. And even though we all salute to creativity, we must respect the fact that it's complicated. What advice would you give to anyone walking up and down and toward the Palais? We're dealing with a lot of significant creative directors who are going to be winning gold lions. Do they really need to care about what we're talking about today?
I'll take it. I think they need, obviously, you don't want compliance to limit creativity, but there is an awareness level that I think is sound for the entire suite of players in the industry. So definitely something to understand, because ultimately those processes that we're talking about, Carla, that you're required to comply with or have strong processes and controls in place, a lot of those processes are starting with the creatives and move along the chain, right? So I think
that's a good point.
Right.
That's a good
Everyone
point.
needs to understand there might be an input or there might be a piece in that chain of what's the process that needs to be compliant.
Yeah, let me just add to that I think everybody in the creative arena really needs to care about this, because if they don't, ultimately what's going to happen is the accountants and the lawyers and procurement are going to be running your business, not the creative is going to be the driving force. And that you do not want.
And
that would be a nightmare. So it's kind of turned upside down right now, and there's way too many lawyers involved in this, way too many accountants involved in this, way too many consultants involved in this. It's great for us. Bring it on. But is that really what advertising ought to be about in the end of the day? Is that the discussion that ought to be had here, as opposed to a discussion about great creativity?
And Doug, you had a percentage of advertisers that are even aware of the problem, because we remember the headlines from the advertising agency. We remember the, oh my gosh, this can't be true. And now we have Emmanuelle kind of come back, and the advertising agencies have kind of had their discussions and are continuing discussions with clients. But Doug, a year later, how many advertisers still may not even understand that there is the need for discussion?
Well, there was an interesting survey just done on agency compensation, where among all the procurement folks at the advertisers who deal with this, 25% of them responded that they were not even aware that transparency was an issue. Now, how that's possible is beyond me. That's just mind-boggling. Of the 75% that said they were aware of it, about 50% said they did anything about it. So if you do the math, that means the majority of the industry has done nothing about the transparency issue over the past year, which is really mind-boggling under various issues, including regulatory issues like Sarbanes-Oxley, where you have to make sure that there are financial controls in place to address potential fraud or whatever. It's not that you have to fix it, but you at least have to do something about it and recognize that it exists and put some things into place. If more than 50% of the industry effectively has either been totally unaware or done nothing about it, that's a serious problem in the marketplace that needs to be addressed, and that's why the debate and the dialogue needs to go on until the tail starts wagging the dog. This is what I said earlier. I mean, this tail's getting bigger and bigger, and if the industry doesn't really address this and get its arms around it, it's going to start wagging the dog.
This industry is a very imaginative, fun, and creative industry. One of the things that I say often is that there's three kinds of people. There are Word people, PowerPoint people, and Excel people. And the challenge within this industry is that I believe it's a PowerPoint industry that's now being run by Excel people and the Excel issues. And so as we celebrate the creativity, we have to all understand that all the money flows in this entire industry. Every dollar that's being spent here on rosé wine came from a client somewhere. And to understand the client agency contract and the flow of the money is incredibly important. Do you find that when you're in your dealings, is there a depth of understanding within clients and within agencies about the terms of the contract?
I unequivocally no. You know, there's clearly a shock and a shock situation we're in. They don't even know where the contracts are half the time. Yes. When they find them, they're years old. They haven't been updated. I mean, there's such a crying need for attention to this in the marketplace. But you know, to their defense, they didn't need it. I remember when I've been in this. You and I have been in this business over 40 years. We won't say how long. Exactly, but I can remember.
I started as a child, but you know.
Yeah, right. I remember when I first came into this industry after law school, and I asked my mentor at the time whether there was a contract for this multi-million-dollar media buy, and he said, "No, there's no contract. They just call up and do it." I said, "Why can it not be a contract? We're lawyers. There has to be contracts." And he goes, "No, it works. Leave it alone. It works." Well, that's kind of been the MO. It works, and it has worked, but now it's broken. And how broken it is remains to be seen, but it's got to be fixed, otherwise it'll be permanently broken, and the industry will truly suffer for it, and in the end, so will creativity.
And before I go to Emmanuelle again about contracts, Doug, you represent the advertisers. We talk about incentive bonuses. We talk about commission or bonus or the amount of money you can make and profitability, and is there any limit to what the profitability is that an agency can make?
No, not at all. I mean, it's not a matter of anybody saying they can't make money or they can't have non-transparent transactions or whatever it is. It's just we're at a tipping point now where the advertiser and the brand simply wants to know exactly how the game works, where the money flows, how it flows, so that they can better understand and properly marshal their fiduciary duty to their shareholders on how they're supposed to watch their money.
And I wanted to make sure we talked about that, because I think there is a great misunderstanding that the ANA report limits the profitability of agencies. That's not what we're talking about, Emmanuelle, right?
Right. No, that's not. Obviously, they're in the business of making money, like many of us. So I think it's absolutely fair that they do. I think what the questions were, or at least the challenges that the report was raising, was more around how transparent are you about the margin that you're making or the way you're making money. And sometimes it's hard to describe in a contract. That's why I think a lot of the issue is a lack of dialogue, perhaps. On the other hand, contracts have to be read, they have to be understood, so compliance can be exercised, and that's a lot of the things that we're helping companies do, is understand what are the commitments that companies are making that they need to comply with.
So what's coming next? One of the things that should be coming next in the life of any marketer, advertising agency, client, supplier, pull out that contract, read and understand the contract, have the discussion, have the dialogue, understand the terms, and follow the money. Is that fair?
That's pretty fair, yeah.
That's what's coming next. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Emmanuelle.
Thank you.
Questions? Questions? Any questions?
Thanks very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm Mark Bembridge from Smartology. I'm very interested in the media buying cycle programmatically, which I think is perhaps at a transparency level really complicated, in the sense that we have a client with the money, we then have a planning agency, a trading desk, we have a demand-side platform, an ad exchange, a supply-side platform. Somewhere in the middle there's a DMP, and at the end the yield comes out at the publisher. And The Guardian did a very interesting case study at the end of last year, which they published, talking about how for every £100 they spent buying media on their own site, they saw as little as £30 back. Now that speaks to transparency. There's too much technology tax going through the system. And I struggle to understand, outside of a regulatory position, how you need back-to-back contracts between all these players in order to fix that. Is it not, and they're all competing, is it not a regulatory issue that needs to, but like at French government level, needs to come into play to help address that? Because how else would you make that a more fair system and a more transparent system?
To answer your question, should there be a regulatory intrusion into this transparency problem in programmatic? There are three options you have. You have regulation, you have self-regulation, and you have individual action. It needs to start on the individual action, where the brand says, I want accountability down at the demand side, or the publisher says, I want accountability up the supply chain. So until that happens, you're not going to really have a meaningful solution. And the AdFin study that I'd encourage everybody to read that came out a couple of weeks ago proves that on the demand side anyway, you can have that level of transparency. You can follow the water flow, or the waterfall rather, of where your money's going and being diluted along the chain. Because that's what you need to know. You need to know what is the dilution. Self-regulation can definitely play a role in this with organizations like TAG and the MRC and others who are creating standards. The last thing you want is for the regulators to come in, because regulators don't understand your business. They have no idea what you do. And trust me, we've seen it too many times that regulation ends up throwing the baby out with the bathwater and really doesn't solve the problem at all.
So it's not regulate, it's educate. More questions?
I think we've got one here.
Hey, Cameron from Cross Media. So let's say contracts are looked at, redone, trust is somewhat restored as best as it can be in the client-agency relationship, and we're 5 years from now. Do the holding companies exist in the current model? Is there an oligopoly? Do you see this breaking apart? Do you see further consolidation? What does the landscape look like in your guys' mind?
Maybe I'll start. I think certainly consolidation. I think what you described, someone in the audience described earlier, is exactly one of the challenges. Is the ecosystem is really crowded and fragmented, and you've seen some of that concentration already happen, right? There's a lot of M&A activity in the space, so I think that will simplify quite a bit the environment that everyone has to play with. That should help, and that's kind of, if you think about the normal cycle of a maturing industry. That's probably the natural next step of the cycle.
Yeah, 5 years from now, I think that it may be a smaller oligopoly, but I think that the likelihood is it'll still be controlled by a relatively small handful. They have relationships that go back very far, and there are options that have sort of a level of credibility, rightly or wrongly, that are in the marketplace. But I think there's also a huge opportunity for independence and outside that control center to build by either through acquisition and consolidation with other players, to look at the ecosystem, particularly in programmatic, to sort of simplify that, as Emmanuelle is talking about. There's a lot of opportunity. Do I think it'll be a completely different landscape in 5 years? Not likely. This industry is slower than an oil tanker. It takes forever for it to really move.
Although you look at the names of the companies 5 years ago here, today, and 5 years from now, the people in the middle on that famous slide, there's a lot of new names and old names disappearing, and I think that may change independent of anything we're talking about. You had a question over here.
Okay, this is the last question.
I'll be quick. Martin also with Cross Media, sorry. I have in Germany, the whole transparency scandal broke 10 years earlier. Most people would probably agree today that nothing much has changed. The whole industry has sort of gotten down to business and everybody knows about it, but essentially the industry has not changed that much. So I'm guessing that's probably due to the fact that you guys didn't come in for most of them to advise them, and to either they didn't find their contracts for the life of them, or somehow they couldn't really switch them. What's your advice especially to mid-size and smaller clients that would say, I can't afford you, or I can't find my contract? What can they do? And what's your explanation for a market that really hasn't changed very much, even though the same kind of scandal broke?
Yeah, a lot of people can afford me, by the way, but we'll put that aside to cut that one out. That's not in the thing. And Emmanuelle has said it, and Carla has said it. It's a continue the dialogue, up the volume, through the trade associations, through events like this, don't let those who don't want to have this dialogue win. In the end of the day, that to me is the most important thing, if you keep that volume up, if you keep that conversation going through as many avenues as you can, if you have people out there who are trying to be evangelists about it and trying to talk about it and be honest about it, then maybe there can be some change. If we are complacent, there won't be. Germany's a great example. You're right. This blew up 10 years ago in Germany, and there have been some cases that have followed since then. There was one the last 2 years, which is a pretty significant case in Germany on this issue. Yet it's so. You know,
And-
what's happened? When are going to the wake-up call's in? The question is, at least 25% of them aren't hearing the wake-up call, and whether that other 75% out there are going to heed to it, they'll be, I think, drawn kicking and screaming as long as the volume stays up.
And being another person who remembers the German crisis, I don't agree that nothing changed after the German crisis, because I remember the reaction to the German crisis and the German impact, and I do not believe there's any client of any size or any agency of any size that can't have the dialogue. There's a relationship, and it goes down to the relationship between a client and an agency and the trust and respect between a customer and the supplier. And you must have an honest, transparent, open dialogue about the transfer of the money in that relationship and the performance of services in that relationship. And the client must respect that the agency needs to make money and profit, and the agency must have enough confidence to tell the client, we need to make that money. And that is, you know, when we talk about what's happening next, let's please have more honest and transparent conversations that will lead to more solutions.